Welcome to a journey through one of the most unsettling mysteries in Appalachian history. Before we begin, drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Today, we're uncovering a story long hidden in silence. A case wiped clean from official archives, intentionally forgotten by those who wished it would stay buried. What took place in the cold mountains of West Virginia during the winter of 1923 is something few have ever heard. This is the haunting account of the Crowe family, a name erased from history, yet still murmured among the oldest families of that isolated land. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains, particularly in Pocahontas County, West Virginia, winters came with relentless power. Dirt paths froze into perilous trails, and small communities were cut off from the world for weeks, sometimes months. People survived through self-reliance and the support of neighbors. Law enforcement often took days to arrive, if they came at all, forcing locals to settle disputes and create their own code of survival. The Crowe family lived on a secluded stretch of land roughly 15 miles from the nearest town, Marlinton. They were known for keeping to themselves, private, almost hermetic, rarely seen in town except to trade supplies. The family patriarch, Thomas Crowe, was 47 when the strange events began. His wife, Margaret, was 42. Living with them were 3 other relatives. 2 of Thomas's brothers and a distant cousin who had moved in after losing her husband. Their property included a solid wooden farmhouse, a barn, several smaller sheds, and about 100 acres of rugged land, part field, part thick forest. The Crowes ran a modest farm, raising pigs, chickens, and a few cows. They grew corn, beans, and potatoes, and like many mountain families, they distilled their own whiskey. Although prohibition had been law since 1920, in the Appalachians it was more of a distant idea than a rule. Federal officers rarely dared to climb those steep, frozen trails, and when they did, the locals always seemed to know ahead of time. The first hint that something was terribly wrong came in February 1923. A traveling peddler named Elijah Morrison, who made his rounds selling medicines, tools, and gossip, stopped by the Crowe place as he had done for over a decade. But this time, things felt different. The property was silent. No smoke curled from the chimney despite the bitter cold. The animals in the barn cried out, clearly unfed for days. Morrison knocked on the door. No response. He called their names. Nothing. Worried, he decided to look around the property. Strange tracks marked the snow, footprints overlapping in odd directions, dark patches on the ground he didn't want to look at too closely. Peering through a side window, he caught a glimpse of something that made his stomach drop. Without hesitation, Morrison jumped onto his wagon and raced down the icy mountain road as fast as he could. He reached Marlinton at dusk and burst into the county sheriff's office, breathless and trembling. His account left even Sheriff Henry Caldwell, a man who'd seen plenty, shaken. Morrison spoke rapidly and disjointedly about symbols painted on the inside walls, about strange arrangements of objects in the main room, and a dreadful feeling that seemed to hang in the air. Something profoundly wrong. The next morning, Sheriff Caldwell assembled 4 trusted deputies and set out for the Crowe homestead. The journey took nearly 5 hours over rough, frozen ground. When they arrived, everything was as Morrison had described. The house was empty but looked recently lived in. The animals were half-starved, and the inside of the house was like nothing they'd ever seen. Every wall in the main room was marked with symbols drawn in what seemed to be charcoal mixed with some dark, sticky substance. They weren't crosses or anything from known religion. They looked ancient, almost primal. On the wooden floor was a large circle surrounded by objects placed at deliberate points: rusty knives, scraps of fabric, small animal bones, melted candles forming warped shapes. But the most chilling discovery lined the side walls: shelves filled with glass jars, each carefully labeled with names and dates. Inside were unknown materials, dark fluids, colored powders, and preserved organic bits. The names on the labels matched members of the Crowe family, and others from the surrounding area, some alive, some long dead. Sheriff Caldwell ordered a full search. His men scoured the barn, sheds, and woods. They found no bodies, no signs of a fight. But something far more disturbing: a diary hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the main bedroom. It belonged to Thomas Crowe. The earliest entries dated back to 1918 and spoke of illness, harsh winters, and failed crops. Thomas wrote about despair, about watching his family suffer and feeling powerless to help. But starting around 1920, The tone changed drastically. He described discovering an old, authorless book at a forgotten estate sale, written in archaic English filled with words he couldn't understand. It claimed to contain ancient practices that offered protection, prosperity, and mastery over misfortune. Thomas referred to it as the old wisdom of the mountains, knowledge suppressed by churches and the modern world. He became consumed by its contents, filling his diary with copied rituals, formulas, and invocations. Thomas eventually persuaded his family to take part in what he described as a renewed covenant with the ancient forces said to dwell in those mountains long before European settlers ever arrived. His journal outlined ceremonies performed on particular nights, always tied to the phases of the moon or dates Thomas believed held special meaning. The family would gather inside the marked circle in their main room, carrying out intricate rituals using the very objects the sheriff later uncovered. Thomas seemed convinced that these rites produced real results: unexplained recoveries from illness, successful hunts, and a strange protection from the brutal cold. Yet he often wrote about a price that had to be paid, though he never explained exactly what that meant. The final pages of the diary, dated January 1923, revealed a man unraveling. Thomas wrote of nightly visions, disembodied voices calling to him from the woods, and the eerie sensation of being watched at all times. He claimed the Pact demanded renewal, that the blessings they'd enjoyed for years now required repayment. The last entry, written just 3 days before Morrison's visit, reads simply, "Today we fulfill our part. May the mountains receive us as promised." Sheriff Caldwell and his men remained at the property until dark, documenting everything. They photographed the strange markings, secured the diary, and catalogued the jars and other bizarre artifacts. But even with all that evidence, one pressing question lingered: where was the Crowe family? 5 adults had simply vanished without leaving a trace. The following morning, the sheriff organized an official search party, over 20 men, a mix of local volunteers and members of the county guard. They divided into groups to comb the wilderness surrounding the Crowe farm. The Appalachian terrain there was treacherous even in good weather, filled with ravines, caves, and frozen rivers slicing through deep valleys. Now, blanketed by winter snow, it became nearly impassable. For 3 full days, the men scoured miles of wilderness. They found faint footprints leading from the house toward the thicker forest, but the tracks overlapped in confusing patterns, circling back on themselves. In some places, the trail abruptly ended, as though the people walking had simply vanished. There was no fresh snowfall to hide the tracks. They just stopped, dissolving into the icy silence. On the 3rd day, one search party stumbled upon something chilling: a circular formation carved into the frozen earth, roughly 2 miles north of the Crowe home. It resembled the symbol drawn on the farmhouse floor, though this one was etched outdoors, partly hidden by snow. Around it were 5 neatly folded stacks of clothing. Each pile was identified as belonging to a member of the Crowe family. Every item was present: coats, shirts, trousers, boots, even undergarments, all arranged with deliberate precision. But there were no bodies, no blood, no struggle. Just the eerie sight of clothing abandoned in perfect order in the middle of the forest. That night, according to weather station records from nearby Elkins, temperatures had plunged to nearly 15 degrees C. No person could survive long in such cold without proper clothing, yet no remains were ever found. Searchers spread out across a 2-kilometer radius around the clearing, checking every crevice, every thicket, every boulder. There was nothing. It was as if 5 people had walked into the freezing night and disappeared into thin air. Sheriff Caldwell, a grounded and skeptical man by nature, was left without a logical explanation. Word of the vanishing spread quickly through the Appalachian settlements. Within weeks, new testimonies surfaced, each more unsettling than the last. A farmer living 5 miles south of the Crowe homestead reported seeing strange lights the night before the disappearance. They weren't lanterns or campfires, he said, but flickering bursts of bluish, green light, pulsing in rhythmic patterns as if following some kind of code. An elderly woman from Marlinton told investigators she had spoken with Margaret Crowe 2 weeks prior. She recalled Margaret appearing distant and hollow-eyed, her movements mechanical. When asked how the family was doing, Margaret replied that they were preparing for a long journey, one they might not return from, to honor old promises. At the time, the woman assumed she meant visiting distant kin. Only later did she grasp the chilling implication of those words. Another witness, a lumberjack working near the area, described hearing haunting chants echoing from the Crowe property on several nights that January. The sounds were not hymns or folk songs, but eerie, discordant tones sung in an unfamiliar language by multiple voices. The chanting carried through the forest, making the animals fall silent and dogs wail in fear. In March 1923, the Pocahontas Times published a short article about the case. It mentioned that a local family had vanished under mysterious circumstances, and that search efforts continued, but left out the disturbing details. Later, editor Robert Sutton admitted he intentionally omitted certain facts to prevent widespread panic. Meanwhile, Sheriff Caldwell found himself at an impasse. He possessed undeniable physical evidence of something extraordinary, yet had no corpses, no witnesses, and no suspects. How could he label the case? Voluntary disappearance, death by exposure, or something far darker that he couldn't define? Pressure mounted from locals demanding answers and from state officials eager to avoid bad publicity. In the end, Caldwell chose to send Thomas Crowe's diary, along with some of the collected objects, to a folklore professor at West Virginia University in Morgantown, an expert in regional legends and Appalachian occult traditions. Professor David Whitmore of West Virginia University spent several weeks analyzing the strange materials sent by Sheriff Caldwell. His written response, dated April 1923, was both illuminating and deeply unsettling. Whitmore explained that the markings discovered on the Crowe family's walls appeared to come from belief systems far older than European settlement. Rituals that combined traces of pre-colonial indigenous spirituality with elements of medieval European occultism. Such traditions, he noted, likely arrived with Scottish and Irish immigrants who had settled in the Appalachian highlands during the 1700s and 1800s. While Christianity had erased or condemned most of these practices, fragments of the old ways had survived in the region's most isolated hollows, passed quietly through families who kept their customs hidden from outsiders. Whitmore identified the main concept in Thomas Crowe's diary, the so-called Pact of Renewal, as a recurring theme in those ancient mountain beliefs. In their worldview, the mountains themselves were living beings, guardians of the land that could bestow health, abundance, and safety in exchange for loyalty and offerings, sometimes even sacrifices. According to the professor, the mysterious book Thomas had purchased was most likely a local grimoire, one of the few to survive the religious purges of the 19th century. These grimoires described cyclical covenants in the early phases. Followers received small blessings, healing, protection, good fortune. But with each cycle, the demand, or payment, grew heavier. Eventually, there came a final moment when the ultimate debt had to be paid in full. Whitmore cautiously proposed that the Crowe family may have sincerely believed their time of payment had come, and had willingly surrendered themselves to the mountain as the final act of their covenant. The professor's letter left Sheriff Caldwell deeply disturbed. He was a man of law, trained to deal with concrete evidence and human motives, not with mysteries of faith or folklore. Yet now he faced an event that refused to fit any rational category: 5 people gone, no bodies, no tracks, only symbols and silence. It wasn't a crime he could prosecute, it was an absence that defied explanation. As spring turned to summer, the case grew stranger still. By May 1923, with the snow finally thawed, Caldwell launched another large-scale search. This time he enlisted expert trackers from neighboring counties, men who had spent their lives navigating the wildest parts of the Appalachian backcountry. They explored uncharted caves, scaled cliffs, and rappelled into steep ravines. They followed frozen riverbeds, dredged small lakes, and combed through thickets where daylight barely touched the ground. After nearly 3 weeks, they had found nothing, not a single bone, scrap of fabric, or footprint. It was as if the entire family had been swallowed by the wilderness. One veteran tracker, Joseph Ricks, told the sheriff something that chilled him. In his 42 years in those mountains, he said, no person or animal had ever vanished without leaving some trace behind, a footprint, torn cloth, or disturbed brush. But these people, Ricks said, it's like they never walked this earth at all. While the physical search reached a dead end, Caldwell's background investigation into the Crowe family began uncovering dark details from their past. He discovered that Thomas Crowe was not native to West Virginia. He had arrived in 1898 from eastern Tennessee, purchasing his 100-acre property for $200 in cash, a considerable amount at the time, with no record of where the money came from. Further digging revealed Thomas had lived in at least 3 different towns across Tennessee and North Carolina before that, each time leaving suddenly under strange circumstances. A newspaper clipping from 1895 in Carter County, Tennessee, mentioned a man named Thomas Crowe under investigation after a series of unexplained livestock deaths. The inquiry was dropped for lack of proof. His wife, Margaret Crowe Thornton, also had an unusual lineage. Born in 1881 in the North Carolina mountains, she came from a line of reputed folk healers. Her grandmother had been a well-known herbalist sought for cures across the region. But the Thornton family's reputation carried a darker side. Locals whispered that their healing sometimes crossed into forbidden practices. Thomas's brothers, Samuel and William Crowe, had been expelled from a Baptist congregation in 1905 for conduct incompatible with Christian principles. Church records were vague but referenced pagan superstitions and corrupting influence. The final member, a distant cousin known only as Ruth, had joined the household in 1919 following her husband's sudden death. Official reports listed natural causes, yet the man had been only 38 and in excellent health. Taken together, these fragments revealed a pattern. The Crowes were not an ordinary family who had stumbled into superstition. They were people connected by a shared heritage of occult folklore, drawn to the preservation of ancient mountain traditions, long rejected by mainstream society. It was as if Thomas had gathered those of similar bloodlines and beliefs to form a secret enclave devoted to keeping that old knowledge alive. Then, in June 1923, something unexpected happened. An elderly man arrived unannounced at the sheriff's office. His name was Ezekiel Harper, a 74-year-old from the Droop Mountain area. He told Caldwell that he carried a burden he could no longer keep. A truth about the Crowes he had concealed for years. Harper claimed to have met Thomas Crowe in the winter of 1918, when a deadly Spanish flu epidemic swept through the region. He had lost 3 members of his own family during that time, including his wife of 4 decades. In his desperation, Harper had turned to every doctor he could find, but no one offered a cure. That's when someone quietly mentioned the name Thomas Crowe, claiming he possessed knowledge beyond traditional medicine. Harper made his way to the Crowe property and met Thomas, who agreed to help, but only under certain conditions. Thomas told Harper he could protect what remained of his family, but the cure required a ritual and a different kind of payment. Something not measured in money. Desperate and grieving, Harper consented. The ritual took place deep within the forest and lasted the entire night. Thomas directed Harper to trace strange symbols into the soil, bury objects at marked points, and chant words in a tongue he couldn't understand. Miraculously it worked, or seemed to. Harper's surviving relatives recovered from the flu, while countless others around them perished. Yet from that night onward, Harper claimed, he felt something unnatural had changed. He suffered vivid dreams of the mountains whispering to him, voices calling his name from the dark. He sensed eyes on him at all hours. Worst of all, he noticed his body aging far too quickly, as though time itself were devouring him. He remembered Thomas's warning that night, nothing from the old powers comes free. The forces that dwell within the earth, Thomas said, always demand balance. Whatever they give must one day be repaid in full. There were cycles, renewals, and finally, an ending, when the debt reached its peak. Only after hearing of the Crowe family's disappearance did Harper finally understand what Thomas had meant. Their time had come, and the family had paid that final price. Harper's statement was formally recorded, though it brought little clarity to the investigation. Sheriff Caldwell didn't know whether to dismiss it as a delusion born of age and grief, or to treat it as the only explanation that fit. Still, he began quietly searching for other stories, wondering whether anyone else had turned to Thomas Crowe for help. What he found was unsettling. Between 1918 and 1922, at least 7 people from neighboring counties had visited the Crowe home, each seeking help in moments of desperation. Incurable sickness, devastating droughts, family strife. In every instance, Thomas had offered aid, but always tied to rituals and vague warnings about payment. A farmer from Randolph County recalled how Thomas saved his withering cornfield during the brutal drought of 1920. Within 2 weeks of Thomas's ritual, rain fell heavily, but only over that single farm. His harvest was abundant while others lost everything. Yet afterward, nothing ever grew there again. The soil turned lifeless as if drained of spirit. Another account came from a widow in Webster County. In 1921, her only son was dying of advanced tuberculosis. Doctors had given up hope, but she heard of Thomas at a local fair and summoned him in secret. For 3 nights, Thomas stayed by the boy's bedside, burning pungent herbs and murmuring words no one recognized while marking the floors with strange shapes. By the 4th morning, the boy's fever broke. Within 2 weeks, he could walk. Within a month, he seemed entirely well. Physicians were astonished, but the mother soon realized the healing had come at a cost. Her son's body was alive, but something inside him was missing. His eyes were hollow, his laughter gone. He worked, ate, and spoke, yet there was no warmth left in him. She said she had her son's flesh, but not his soul, and only then did Thomas's cryptic warning about cost make sense. Pattern after pattern emerged. Thomas Crowe wasn't a harmless recluse dabbling in folklore. He had become a quiet legend, a man people sought when all else failed, whose strange methods consistently produced results that science couldn't explain. But every gift came attached to an invisible burden, a debt that lingered until the time of collection. Hoping for clarity, Sheriff Caldwell sought counsel from the local clergy. Reverend Samuel Mitchell of the Marlinton Methodist Church, an elder scholar of regional law, offered context. He explained that the Appalachian Mountains had long been a crossroads where many spiritual traditions intertwined. When settlers from Scotland, Ireland, and Germany arrived in the 1700s and 1800s, they didn't just bring Christianity, they also carried fragments of older, forbidden beliefs from their homelands. In these remote, isolated ranges far from church and government control, those ancient customs survived. They mingled with the wisdom of the region's first peoples, the Cherokee and Shawnee, creating a layered belief system that persisted quietly beneath the surface of everyday life. The Reverend said the church had always known of this shadow faith. Some families practiced Christianity publicly, but kept older rituals alive in secret. Farmers timed their crops by lunar cycles. Healers combined scripture with incantations, and some still honored days unknown to the church calendar. Most of the time, the church turned a blind eye, so long as these customs stayed hidden and harmless. But Thomas Crowe had crossed that line. He had revived those ancient practices openly, structured them into something organized, something potent, and perhaps something resembling an alternative faith. Worse still, unlike superstition, his rituals produced undeniable outcomes. And that, Reverend Mitchell said gravely, made him dangerous not just to souls, but to the balance that kept the mountains quiet. Not only to the church, but to the entire social structure built upon a long, established spiritual order. Reverend Mitchell then revealed something he had kept to himself for many years. In 1922, he had personally confronted Thomas Crowe. Determined to bring the family back to Christianity, he made the difficult trip to their secluded homestead deep within the mountains. The meeting haunted him ever since. Thomas greeted the Reverend politely, but carried an unsettling certainty about his own beliefs. He told Mitchell that his rejection of Christianity was not born from disbelief, but from the conviction that it was incomplete. According to Thomas, the churches had forgotten the oldest truths, had cut humanity off from forces that existed long before Scripture was ever written. The mountains existed before men named their gods, he had said, and the mountains remember. He spoke of cycles of energy that governed all things, of a natural balance where nothing came without cost. Every gift required repayment, every light a shadow. While modern religion promised salvation through faith alone, Thomas claimed real understanding came from acknowledging the exchange that sustained existence. He said he had made his choice knowingly and would face the final cost without fear when the time came. The conversation left Reverend Mitchell deeply shaken. He later tried to have Thomas branded a dangerous heretic, but the Crowe family lived so far removed from society that they held little open influence. Those who sought Thomas's help did so quietly, never admitting it publicly. It was impossible to confront something that lived in secrecy, neither defying the church openly nor submitting to it. Now, with the entire family gone, the Reverend felt both vindicated and horrified. Vindicated because Thomas's disappearance proved the danger he had once sensed, and horrified because 5 people had vanished in a way that defied reason, faith, and even imagination. Mitchell confessed to Sheriff Caldwell that he could no longer tell whether the cause was demonic, natural, or psychological. A possession, a phenomenon of the earth, or a ritualized madness leading to self-destruction. In July 1923, the Pocahontas Times printed a follow-up article, this time including more precise details. Editor Robert Sutton felt the townspeople deserved transparency. The piece described the strange symbols inside the Crowe house, excerpts from Thomas's diary, and the neatly folded clothing left behind. It also featured testimonies from several locals who had once sought help from the family. The reaction was immediate and divisive. Some citizens demanded that authorities take stronger measures to uncover the truth. Others, especially those from the isolated hills, fell silent, believing the paper had trespassed into matters best left unspoken. Letters flooded the newsroom. A few thanked the editor for exposing the story, but many were threatening. Some warned that meddling with such ancient forces would bring disaster. Others claimed that certain knowledge was not meant for all eyes. One chilling letter, signed only, Guardian of the Mountains, declared that the Crowe family had merely fulfilled the law of the old ways, that any attempt to disturb their fate or probe further would be met with retribution. The sheriff took this message seriously. He increased patrols around town, fearing that hidden practitioners might still exist. An underground network scattered through the mountain valleys. If the Crowes had been only one group, others might still be active, bound to the same mysterious pact. And if that pact required renewal, more disappearances could follow. Throughout the summer of 1923, sporadic search efforts continued whenever storms or landslides shifted the landscape. Each change brought new hope that a clue might finally surface. Yet the mountains held their silence. No bones appeared, no lost objects resurfaced, nothing but the eerie odor of the clothing left in that clearing. As autumn approached, the mystery deepened. In September, strange phenomena began troubling nearby farms. 3 ranchers reported their animals behaving erratically. Horses balked at familiar trails, refusing to move forward. Dogs howled each evening at twilight, staring toward the northern ridges. Cattle gathered at the edges of fields, trembling as if to avoid something unseen. One farmer, Jacob Brennan, recounted an especially unsettling moment. While inspecting fences near the border of his land, just a mile from the old Crowe property, he suddenly felt the air grow thick and charged, humming with an invisible current like the moments before a lightning storm. Yet the sky was perfectly clear. Then, faintly, he heard voices, many of them, chanting in eerie unison. He couldn't distinguish the words, but the melody matched descriptions others had given months earlier. Terrified, Brennan fled to his house, locking the doors and keeping his family inside. The strange singing continued for nearly 20 minutes before stopping as abruptly as it had begun. The next morning, he returned to find a blackened ring scorched into the earth at the exact spot where he'd stood. The grass and plants within were burned to ash, though no smell of smoke lingered and no sign of flame remained. It was as if the ground itself had been seared by heat without fire. Sheriff Caldwell visited the site, collected samples, and sent them to West Virginia University for testing. The results, received 3 weeks later, provided no explanation. The soil showed exposure to immense heat but contained no fuel residue or chemical traces. It was simply, unnaturally, burned. These new events reignited public fascination with the Crowe mystery. Some residents began to whisper that perhaps the family hadn't died at all, that they had retreated deep into the mountains to continue their rituals unseen. Others believed something had been unleashed that final night, something that now roamed freely through the forests. Rumors multiplied, growing wilder with each retelling, drifting further from the facts until truth and legend were indistinguishable. And by October, the sense of unease that settled over the valley felt less like fear of the unknown, and more like recognition of something ancient that had finally awakened. The sheriff received an unanticipated visitor, a man introducing himself as Arthur Blackwood, an independent investigator of strange phenomena who had journeyed from Washington to assist with the case. Blackwood looked every bit the scholar: lean frame, round spectacles, a modest suit, and a worn leather briefcase filled with notebooks and unfamiliar instruments. He explained that for the past 15 years, he had been cataloging similar disappearances throughout the Appalachian region. According to him, the Crowe family's disappearance was far from unique. His research detailed at least a dozen comparable incidents across Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia spanning the last 50 years. The cases all shared disturbing parallels: secluded families following unconventional spiritual practices, sudden vanishings without any remains recovered, signs of ritualistic activity, and neatly folded clothes left in circular patterns within forest clearings. The consistencies were too strong to dismiss as coincidence. Blackwood presented his meticulously organized notebooks to the sheriff. Each volume contained dates, precise locations, sketches of strange symbols, and eyewitness accounts. The earliest entry traced back to 1877 in Harlan County, Kentucky, where a family of 6 vanished after locals reported strange chanting and glowing lights on their property. The family was never found, yet their garments were discovered laid out in a perfect circle, each piece folded with ceremonial care. What troubled the sheriff most was Blackwood's observation of a pattern in time. These disappearances seemed to follow 7-year cycles, often occurring during the winter months on moonless nights. Blackwood believed these events were connected to ancient ceremonial calendars, cycles guided by celestial movements once charted by pre-colonial peoples. He elaborated that the Appalachian Mountains had long been sacred to indigenous nations. The Cherokee called it the place where spirits walk. Certain mountain sites were said to be thin places, portals between the physical and spiritual worlds. When European settlers arrived, they brought their own esoteric traditions, which blended with native beliefs, forming hybrid systems of occult practice. Blackwood suspected that Thomas Crowe had uncovered one of these forgotten systems, perhaps through the enigmatic book mentioned in his diary, and had enacted it faithfully. Even the final offering, which was not a sacrifice of others but of oneself. In his view, the Crowe family had willingly given themselves to the unseen forces of the mountains, and somehow, those forces had accepted. The result was a disappearance that defied logic or natural law. Sheriff Caldwell remained doubtful of Blackwood's more mystical conclusions, yet he couldn't ignore the documented evidence. Something beyond comprehension was unfolding in those hills, and the Crowe case hadn't ended it. If anything, the activity had intensified. At Blackwood's request, they visited the Crowe property together on a crisp autumn day as the forests blazed gold and crimson. The home remained untouched since it was sealed months earlier. Locals avoided it entirely. Inside, Blackwood moved methodically, photographing the wall symbols with a specialized camera, collecting vial samples, and taking precise measurements of the floor's ritual circle. He filled pages of notes, occasionally muttering to himself in awe or concern. When they finally departed under the rising moon, Blackwood appeared deeply shaken. He confessed that what he'd seen was unlike anything from his past studies. The symbols weren't mere decorations or random markings. They formed a complete ritual language, encoding instructions that had been executed with uncanny accuracy. He explained that most occult practices remained superficial, simple charms or protective rites, but Thomas Crowe had clearly ventured into far more advanced realms, the kind that aimed to induce actual transformation. If his interpretation was correct, Crowe had completed the process in full. Blackwood offered to compile a comprehensive report for the sheriff, but cautioned it would have little legal merit. It wouldn't name a perpetrator or prove a crime, only record that something extraordinary and unexplainable had taken place, and might well happen again as long as others pursued the same ancient path. The report arrived in November 1923, a 43-page dossier containing photographs, diagrams, chemical analyses, and historical comparisons. Its conclusion was careful but clear. The Crowe family had participated in a ritual of transformation, rooted in a fusion of indigenous and European esoteric traditions. Their physical fate remained uncertain, but the evidence implied they believed they had transcended into another state of being. Then came the harsh winter of 1923. Early blizzards swept across the Appalachians, isolating communities under deep snow. That season marked the beginning of even stranger incidents, not just near the Crowe estate, but across Pocahontas County and beyond. In December, a woman named Sarah Whitfield arrived at the sheriff's office, visibly shaken. Living alone 6 miles east of the old Crowe property, the 51-year-old widow was known as rational and grounded, yet what she reported next would defy every trace of reason. According to Sarah, for 3 nights in a row she had been startled awake by a steady knocking on her front door. Always around 3 a.m. Each time she peered through the window, No one was there. Yet the knocking persisted, deliberate and rhythmic. 3 quick taps, a pause, 2 slower ones, another pause, then 3 quick taps again. The sequence continued for nearly 10 minutes before abruptly ceasing. On the 3rd night, mustering all her courage, Sarah opened the door mid-knock. No person stood outside, but on her doorstep lay something that chilled her blood. 5 small circles drawn in a dark, unidentified substance. Inside each circle rested a strange object, a smooth stone, a torn scrap of fabric, a tiny animal bone, an old coin, and a small glass vial filled with a dark red liquid. Sheriff Caldwell, accompanied by 2 deputies, visited Sarah's cabin the next morning. The scene matched her account perfectly. The sheriff collected the items carefully for analysis. The cloth fragment matched material from garments worn by the Crowe family. The coin, dated 1867, traced back to the Civil War era. Tests revealed that the red liquid was human blood, though its source remained unknown. Most unsettling of all was the polished stone. Under magnification, the surface bore tiny carved symbols, eerily similar to those on the Crowe house walls, yet distinct. As if written in the same occult language, but delivering a different message. Arthur Blackwood, still in the region, examined the stone himself. He grew visibly uneasy, explaining that such symbols represented calls or invitations in several ancient spiritual systems, signs used to summon or recruit. Soon other strange reports emerged. A local farmer awoke to find his barn marked with the same symbols overnight. One family discovered their living room furniture rearranged into a perfect circle while they slept. A seasoned hunter, who knew the forest like his own land, became hopelessly lost, wandering in loops for hours before stumbling home, dazed and frightened. These incidents weren't random. Their patterns and precision suggested purpose. Someone, or something, was communicating through these acts, marking territory, signaling presence, perhaps even seeking new participants to replace the vanished Crowe family. Then, in January 1924, exactly 1 year after the Crowes disappeared, came the event that confirmed Sheriff Caldwell's worst fears. A brutal winter storm swept through the mountains, toppling trees and burying the region under feet of snow. That same night, 5 witnesses from different towns reported seeing figures moving through the blizzard. Shapes that glided above the snow, leaving no visible tracks, vanishing when looked at directly, reappearing only in peripheral vision. Among the witnesses was Reverend Samuel Mitchell. Returning from visiting a sick parishioner, he saw the figures in the storm. At first, he assumed they were travelers caught in the cold and called out to offer shelter. But the figures gave no reply. They continued forward in perfect formation, 5 silhouettes evenly spaced, tracing deliberate lines through the white haze. Curiosity and dread compelled the Reverend to follow. He trailed them for several minutes until, without warning, all 5 turned toward him in unison. Though distance and snow concealed their faces, he felt a gaze so intense that it froze him in place. After what felt like an eternity, he dared to move again, only to find the apparitions gone. At dawn, once the storm subsided, a team searched the area described by the Reverend. What they found defied belief: 5 sets of bare human footprints in the snow, undisturbed and unmistakably real. The tracks matched the formation the Reverend had described and led directly to the clearing where the Crowe family's clothing had been discovered a year before. There, beneath the fresh snow, the original ritual circle was still visible, its boundaries untouched by frost. At its center lay a new arrangement of objects: 5 black candles, still warm and faintly smoking, as if recently extinguished. Surrounding them in a pentagonal pattern were 5 small vials, identical to those from the Crowe home. Each vial contained a different substance: dark soil, murky water, ash, blood, and what appeared to be human hair. When Arthur Blackwood arrived to inspect the scene, he stood silent for a long while. Finally, he told the sheriff this was no random act. It was an anniversary ritual, a commemoration marking a completed cycle. In ancient occult systems, the first anniversary of a major rite was believed to be a moment of heightened power, when the boundary between worlds thinned once again. Whoever performed the ritual was not only honoring the Crowes, but perhaps preparing to continue their work. Blackwood warned that, according to his research, the next 7 years would be crucial. If the pattern held true, another disappearance could occur before 1930. Each new event, he feared, would reinforce the cycle, making it stronger and harder to break. Sheriff Caldwell was left torn. As the county's lawman, He was bound to protect his people. But how could he defend them from an unseen threat with no clear laws broken, no suspects, and no proof beyond eerie patterns and fear? He couldn't arrest someone for arranging candles or symbols in the woods. He couldn't accuse spirits or prosecute superstition. And yet, deep down, he knew something real and dangerous was at work in those mountains, and it was only getting closer. But who was behind it all? Were the Crowes still alive somewhere deep in the mountains? Could it be other followers who had learned from Thomas over the years? Or was it something else entirely? Something beyond human understanding, which the sheriff's rational mind refused to fully entertain. In February 1924, Sheriff Caldwell made a bold and controversial decision. He ordered the Crowe house burned to the ground. Officially, he claimed the building was unsafe, filled with hazardous materials and attracting trespassers. In truth, he hoped that by destroying the house, he might disrupt whatever force was feeding on it. The burning took place on a bleak winter morning. A dozen men encircled the property, while others set it aflame. The house burned for hours, flames climbing higher than seemed possible. Witnesses later described impossible colors flickering within the blaze: deep greens, shimmering blues, and intense purples. More disturbingly, many swore they heard voices in the fire, not the crackle of wood, but harmonized chanting, as though unseen singers were performing from within the flames. When the fire finally died and the ashes cooled, investigators combed through the remains. Most of the house had turned to dust, but in the exact center, where the ritual circle had once been drawn, the wooden planks were still intact. Blackened but unbroken, they bore the same carved symbols, perfectly preserved. It was as if the fire had deliberately spared them. The destruction brought no relief. In the following weeks, strange activity increased threefold. Reports poured in, odd lights, unexplainable noises, footprints appearing overnight. It was as though something had been awakened by the act of burning, and it was angry. Then, in March 1924, loggers working in dense forest north of the old Crowe property made a shocking discovery. While cutting through an ancient oak, one man struck metal deep inside the trunk. When they split the section open, they found a small metal box, about the size of a book, sealed in wax and covered with engraved markings. Counting the growth rings around it, they estimated the box had been hidden there around 1844, 80 years earlier. The superstitious lumberjack refused to open it and took it straight to Sheriff Caldwell, who immediately summoned Arthur Blackwood. Together, they examined the artifact under proper light. The engravings were intricate, different from those found at the Crowe home, but clearly of the same lineage. Blackwood identified some of the markings as protective sigils, others as containment seals, designed not to conceal something from people, but to trap something within. After long debate, they decided to break the wax seal and open it carefully. Inside were three objects: a rolled manuscript, the ink faded but legible; a silver medallion etched with the same strange symbols; a strip of fabric, apparently from an ancient ceremonial garment. The manuscript proved the most astonishing of all. Written in 1843, it was signed by a man calling himself Jonathan Keeper, keeper of the mountain's law. The text served as both confession and warning. Jonathan claimed to have belonged to a hidden community that had practiced ancient rites in the Appalachian Mountains since the early European settlements. According to his account, the group began with 3 Scottish families who arrived around 1760, carrying with them old-world spiritual knowledge, Druidic practices mixed with ceremonial magic. When they met the native peoples of the region, an exchange of beliefs occurred. The indigenous tribes recognized elements of their own traditions, rituals honoring the land and the spirits dwelling within it. Over time, these teachings fused into a hybrid spiritual system, one that taught that the mountains were sentient, ancient entities capable of granting power, but always in exchange for something. For decades, the secret community prospered. Their crops thrived, illness was rare, and accidents seemed to pass them by. But prosperity came at a cost. The first payment arrived in 1815 when one of the founding families vanished overnight, 12 people gone without a trace. In the clearing behind their home, only their clothes remained, folded neatly in a perfect circle, just as the Crowe families would be a century later. From that point onward, the pattern was set. Every 7 years, one family would disappear, always in winter, always after performing a specific ritual, and always leaving only garments behind. The sacred texts explained these vanishings as transformations, the final step of enlightenment, the chosen becoming one with the mountains themselves. But as time went on, Jonathan began to doubt. He wondered whether these so-called transformations were merely ritualized deaths, and whether the mountains' acceptance was nothing more than a mass delusion leading people to perish from exposure and belief. His skepticism made him an outcast, but he was determined to leave behind a warning for those who might follow. Before fleeing the community, he sealed his writings and the relics tied to the old rituals inside a box designed to contain their power. He then hid it within a growing oak tree, hoping that time would bury both the object and the truth it carried. Now, 80 years later, that truth had been unearthed. He hid the box within the tree as a safeguard, a message for whoever might uncover it in the future, should the old customs continue. Jonathan believed that if the rituals persisted, someone would eventually discover his warning and understand the true origins of the practices. Alongside the manuscript, he included the medallion, which he claimed was essential to deciphering the group's more advanced sacred texts, and a piece of ceremonial fabric taken from the last ritual he had witnessed before leaving the community. The final section of Jonathan's writing was ominous. He predicted that the ritual cycle would endure for at least 2 centuries. Each disappearance, he claimed, reinforced the pattern, tightening its hold on those within the tradition. Over time, the influence would grow so strong that resisting the calling would become nearly impossible. He also warned of intensification years, specific points when several groups might vanish at once, marking major intervals in the broader cycles. Jonathan cautioned that trying to end the practice through destruction or violence would accomplish nothing. The power wasn't bound to a house, an artifact, or even a written text. It was part of the land itself, imprinted into the mountains through generations of ritual. The only way to truly break the cycle, he said, was through belief, persuading followers to abandon their devotion voluntarily by offering something equally meaningful to replace it. Arthur Blackwood studied the manuscript repeatedly, finding in it the proof he had long suspected. This was no isolated family cult or coincidence. It was an ancient, inherited tradition, a lineage of belief stretching back over a century and deeply woven into Appalachian history. The Crowes were merely the latest participants in a chain that had endured for nearly 160 years. Using Jonathan's timeline, Blackwood began calculating. If the first recorded disappearance took place in 1815 and the pattern repeated every 7 years, then about 15 cycles had occurred by the time of the Crowe event in 1923. Roughly 15 families lost to the same strange fate. No one had noticed the pattern because each disappearance was separated by distance, time, and silence. Communities preferred not to speak of things that couldn't be explained. Blackwood suggested to Sheriff Caldwell that they attempt to document the full history. If they could trace the pattern across the region, they might identify surviving descendants or hidden practitioners, perhaps even prevent another disappearance by exposing the truth. Throughout the spring and summer of 1924, Blackwood and a deputy combed through county archives across West Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, and North Carolina. They searched for any records of families vanishing during winter months and soon realized the phenomenon was far more widespread than anyone had imagined. The files they uncovered painted a grim, consistent picture, an unbroken thread of disappearances spanning 4 states. 13 cases perfectly fit Jonathan's description. Families vanishing midwinter, clothing found arranged in circles, no bodies ever recovered. The earliest recorded case after Jonathan's was in 1822, Carter County, Tennessee. A family of 9 lost during a brutal blizzard. The sheriff's notes mentioned unusual carvings on nearby trees, though he dismissed them as superstition. Another case from 1856 in Haywood County, North Carolina, caught immediate attention. 7 adult members of the Thornton family disappeared in February, and Thornton happened to be Margaret Crowe's maiden name. Further digging revealed she was distantly related to the missing family, confirming that the knowledge and the curse passed down specific bloodlines. Other documented cases followed 6 people in Harlan County, Kentucky's 1877, 4 in McDowell County, West Virginia's 1884, 5 in Wise County, Virginia's 1890 win. Every 7 years, without fail, the ritual repeated. Even more unsettling was the realization that local authorities had routinely concealed the most disturbing details. Official files mentioned missing persons, but omitted the ritualistic markings, witnesses' strange reports, or any reference to supernatural activity. It wasn't necessarily a coordinated cover-up, more an unspoken rule. Communities simply chose silence over confrontation, preferring to call these events accidents or acts of God. Still, there were rare exceptions. In 1891, a Kentucky sheriff had consulted an anthropologist from the University of Kentucky, Dr. James Whitfield, who compiled a detailed report on hybrid spiritual practices in the Appalachian Mountains. Long forgotten in county archives, Whitfield's report eerily echoed Blackwood's conclusions decades later. Whitfield proposed that the mountains had become a refuge for those rejected by both church and state. Displaced indigenous peoples, European settlers clinging to outlawed traditions, and spiritualists searching for isolation. Over time, their beliefs intertwined, creating a hidden religious system that survived untouched by modernity. He theorized that the disappearances were not random deaths, but the final, a voluntary act of believers seeking transcendence, a physical merging with the land they worshipped. The anthropologist's report included testimonies from former practitioners, offering rare glimpses into their secretive world. One woman described how children born into the faith were raised from an early age to believe that the mountains were alive and always watching. From an early age, children in those secluded mountain communities were taught about the cycles, about the fate awaiting those chosen to complete what they called the journey. It was never presented as death, but as a sacred ascension, emerging with the timeless forces that govern the mountains themselves. One former member, a man who had abandoned his group after witnessing one such ritual, described what he saw in chilling detail. In the days leading up to the ceremony, participants fasted, prayed, and recited old verses said to purify the soul. On the final night, they gathered deep in the forest, marking a perfect circle on the ground, surrounding it with candles and ritual objects of symbolic meaning. Then, with deliberate reverence, they removed and folded their clothes, stepping into the circle together. From his hiding place among the trees, the man watched as the chanting grew louder and more complex, echoing through the forest like 100 overlapping voices. Hours passed. Then, he said, the air itself began to change. The atmosphere thickened, pressing against his chest, as if something vast and unseen were awakening. The figures inside the circle began to glow, soft at first, then radiating an eerie phosphorescence. Within seconds they vanished. The clearing was empty. Only the folded clothes remained. If true, this account defied every known law of nature. These were not people dying of exposure or vanishing by human means. Something else, something science could not yet define, was at work. Though Blackwood was a skeptic by training, he could not entirely dismiss such testimonies, especially given how many echoed the same impossible details across decades and distances. By September 1924, he had gathered all his research into a 200-page report titled The Mountain Cycles, a documented history of ritual disappearances in Appalachia. He distributed copies to Sheriff Caldwell, several universities, the Library of Congress, and the state archives of each affected region. His intent was preservation, ensuring that, should the disappearances continue, future generations would at least know the truth. Reactions were divided. Some scholars saw the document as a breakthrough, a critical record of America's hidden spiritual folklore. Others dismissed it outright, calling it exaggerated, speculative, even sensational. Within the mountain communities, the response was silence. Those who knew the truth avoided speaking. Those who didn't refused to believe. Sheriff Caldwell used the report as the foundation for a local awareness campaign. He held meetings across Pocahontas County, warning residents about the dangers of isolation and cult-like beliefs. He urged caution against those who promised miraculous relief from hardship through forbidden practices. Yet he knew he was up against something far older and deeper than law or reason could touch. He was one man with limited authority, trying to fight a current that had been flowing for generations. Then, as autumn 1924 faded, something new began. Locals started reporting unsettling visitors, strangers appearing uninvited at remote homes. They spoke softly, asked about spiritual matters, and offered books claiming to hold ancient truths. They never stayed long and never gave real names. One family reported that an elderly man with a faint European accent had left behind a leather-bound volume with no title. When the family turned it over to Caldwell, The sheriff recognized the markings immediately. The embossed symbols on the cover were the same as those burned into the walls of the Crowe house. Inside, the text was written in a blend of English, Latin and other languages no one could decipher. Caldwell realized with growing unease that this was the very kind of grimoire Thomas Crowe had described in his journals, the book that had begun his fatal obsession. Winter came early that year. The first snows fell heavy and fast, and the old mountain folk whispered that something in the season felt wrong. The air carried a strange tension, a stillness that seemed to wait. Caldwell doubled patrols near the old sites, though he knew it was futile. The forests were too vast and the mountains too old to be truly watched. In December, Blackwood returned to the county with alarming news. His research across Appalachia had uncovered signs of renewed gatherings. Descendants of families linked to the earlier disappearances were reconnecting, traveling, writing coded letters, meeting in secret. Some of these letters, intercepted through Blackwood's contacts in the postal service, looked ordinary at first, discussing family, crops, and weather. But between the lines lay hidden meanings. Phrases like returning to the old mountains and renewing the bond appeared repeatedly. Dates matched key intervals in the ancient cycle. Blackwood's theory was grim. 1925 wasn't just another point in the pattern. It marked 110 years since the first recorded disappearance, an important number in multiple esoteric traditions, symbolizing the completion of a great cycle. He feared that this anniversary would bring not one ritual, but many. Perhaps a collective event unlike anything seen before. In January 1925, Sheriff Caldwell convened an emergency summit with neighboring county officials. He presented Blackwood's findings, the historical evidence, and the possibility of coordinated mass rituals in the coming months. The reactions were mixed. Some sheriffs vowed to increase patrols and surveillance, while others dismissed the idea outright, unwilling to believe that such an ancient force could still be alive in the modern age. Others dismissed the warnings entirely, brushing them off as superstition and coincidence. One sheriff from Greenbrier County went so far as to mock the idea, declaring publicly that he wouldn't waste time or manpower chasing ghosts and bedtime stories. This divide among the authorities proved disastrous. If something truly was being orchestrated, the absence of coordination between counties meant any response would be fragmented and ineffective. Whoever or whatever was behind the mountain rituals clearly understood this, exploiting the gaps between jurisdictions and the isolation of the terrain. Then, in February 1925, the fears became real. A farmer in Randolph County reported seeing strange lights flickering across the ridges for 3 consecutive nights. They weren't lanterns or campfires, but luminous orbs of shifting blue-green light, moving in rhythmic formations as if following a pattern. Soon, reports poured in from other counties. In Webster, 2 families claimed to hear distant choral singing echoing through the night. In Nicholas County, a hunter stumbled upon 5 circular markings drawn in the snow across a 6-mile stretch. And in Pocahontas County, near the burned remains of the Crowe homestead, locals described an unbearable sense of being watched whenever they entered the woods. Sheriff Caldwell acted swiftly. He mobilized volunteers to patrol the mountains after dark and established a crude but effective telephone network between nearby towns to coordinate any sightings. He instructed residents to report every odd noise, light, or figure, no matter how insignificant it seemed. Then came the night of February 23, 1925. That evening, multiple witnesses across 3 counties saw groups of people silently walking toward the mountains. The groups, ranging from 4 to 7 individuals, moved with eerie precision, unfazed by the freezing air or treacherous ground. Those who tried to follow quickly lost sight of them. The wanderers seemed to know every hidden path and vanished into the forest as though swallowed by it. At dawn on February 24th, search parties made their grim discoveries. In a clearing in Randolph County lay 16 neatly folded sets of clothing arranged in a perfect circle, each pile accompanied by personal effects watches, wedding bands, Bibles, family photographs. But not a single human body. In Webster County, 11 more piles were found in identical fashion. In Nicholas County, 9. And in Pocahontas County, at the very clearing where the Crowe family's garments had been discovered 2 years earlier. There were 7 new piles, perfectly encircling the first. It was as if this new generation had deliberately completed what their predecessors began. In one night, 43 people had vanished. The scale was unprecedented. News spread rapidly from small mountain towns to major newspapers in Charleston, Richmond, and even New York. Headlines screamed of the Appalachian vanishings. What had once been dismissed as folklore could no longer be ignored. The attention brought an influx of officials, state investigators, federal agents, and journalists swarmed the region. Some suspected mass suicide, others whispered of ritual murder or a clandestine cult. For weeks, hundreds of men searched every cave, ravine, and forest path. They brought bloodhounds, combed through homesteads, and examined every lead. But no remains, no traces, no signs of struggle were ever found. It was as if 43 people had simply dissolved into thin air. The federal inquiry eventually shifted focus from where the victims had gone to who they had been. Patterns soon emerged. All 43 shared direct or ancestral links to families from previous disappearance cycles. These weren't random citizens. They were descendants of those bound by the old mountain pact. Interviews with relatives revealed a chilling uniformity. The missing had all begun preparing months earlier. They sold property, paid debts, distributed heirlooms, and wrote farewell letters disguised as casual correspondence. Each spoke of hearing the call, of an overwhelming pull toward the mountains and their ancestral duty. The February 1925 event changed everything. What had once been dismissed as isolated rural superstition was now undeniable, a matter of national fascination and fear. Yet understanding remained elusive. The mystery only deepened. Arthur Blackwood dedicated the rest of that year to documenting every detail. He interviewed friends, relatives, and neighbors of the vanished. He collected their letters, journals, and photographs, compiling what would become one of the most extensive ethnographic records of the phenomenon. Among the artifacts was a diary belonging to Elizabeth Morrison, a 39-year-old schoolteacher, and one of the 43 who vanished. Her writings painted a haunting portrait, not of madness, but of conviction. Over 2 years, her entries traced a transformation from doubt to devotion. She described vivid dreams of the mountains calling to her, an unshakable sense that her daily life was merely a prelude to something far greater. In one of her final entries, dated just a week before the mass disappearance, she wrote, "The wind no longer sounds like wind. It speaks. It carries the same rhythm as the chanting I hear in dreams. I know the path now. I know where it leads. I no longer fear it." Her words became, for Blackwood, the most chilling confirmation yet that these people weren't running from life. They were running to something they believed was waiting for them beyond the veil of the known world. The mountain lineage had endured through secrecy and ritual, its members gathered in hidden places, exchanging knowledge inherited across generations and studying ancient manuscripts said to reveal the deeper nature of existence. Over time, Elizabeth came to believe that death was not an end but a passage, that the mountains themselves offered a gateway to a higher plane of being, beyond the limits of flesh and time. Her final writings were calm, almost joyous. She expressed gratitude for her fate, for being born into a bloodline that had preserved truth when the rest of humanity had lost it. She mentioned quiet goodbyes to people and places she loved, knowing they would never comprehend her decision. And in her last diary entry, dated February 22, 1925, she wrote only, "Tomorrow I return home, to the mountains that have always called to me, to the place where I will finally be complete." Records like hers complicated any straightforward explanation. These individuals weren't gullible victims manipulated by a fanatic. They were willing participants in a sacred tradition they viewed as profound and necessary. That made the case nearly impossible to categorize in legal or psychological terms. How do you define a crime when the perpetrators are the very people who vanished of their own will? Sheriff Caldwell wrestled with that question for years. He stayed in office until 1932, carrying the weight of the unsolved disappearances. When his personal writings were uncovered decades later, his reflections revealed a man transformed. He admitted that he had once tried to interpret everything through logic and law, but ultimately accepted that not all human experiences fit within those boundaries. The Appalachian Mountains, he wrote, harbored enigmas that might never yield to explanation. And perhaps they were never meant to. Some things, he said, dwell forever between the known and the unknowable. In the years after 1925, the strange activity dwindled. No more mass vanishings occurred. It was as if the phenomenon had reached its climax and spent itself entirely. The remaining families dispersed or abandoned their old ways. As modernization reached even the remotest valleys, roads, radios, and government oversight, the secret practices faded. Yet Caldwell cautioned that forgetting was dangerous. Erasing the past, he warned, might allow the same darkness to return, preying again on those seeking transcendence. History, he believed, should serve not as spectacle, but as a solemn reminder of where unexamined faith can lead. Arthur Blackwood, meanwhile, continued his studies until his death in 1948. He published 3 dense, scholarly volumes on the subject, works that never reached the mainstream but became essential reading for folklorists and anthropologists. Through them, the detailed record of what happened in those mountains was preserved, awaiting rediscovery by future generations. The Crowe property itself lay abandoned for decades. The charred ruins of the house crumbled, and saplings grew through the cracked stone foundation. Nature slowly reclaimed the site, yet locals still shunned it, especially during the winter. They said the air there felt different, thick, watchful, as though the land remembered. As time passed, the entire episode slipped into obscurity. Official archives were reorganized, files misplaced or deliberately removed. The disappearances of 1925 were reduced to fragments, scattered newspaper clippings, marginal notes in old reports, half-whispered stories told by those who had once searched the woods. But for the families of the missing, the truth remained unshakable. Something beyond comprehension had occurred. 48 souls in all, including the original Crowe family, had chosen to walk into the silent embrace of the mountains, never to return. A century later, the story remains largely untold. Its erasure seems intentional, born from discomfort, fear, and perhaps a desire to protect the region's reputation from further ridicule. The Appalachian mountains still stand, vast and inscrutable. Travelers hike their trails, unaware of what once transpired in the valleys below. They pass over soil that has swallowed entire generations of secrets. Perhaps that ignorance is mercy. Some mysteries are meant to rest, whispered only among those who understand that the world still holds forces reason cannot contain. In the final note found in Sheriff Caldwell's personnel file, written shortly before his death in 1946, he offered one last thought. I spent my life trying to keep order, to protect people and uphold the law. But the mountains taught me humility. There are powers in this world beyond our jurisdiction. The mountains have their own justice, their own memory and their own truths. We as mortals can only observe and honor the mystery that endures. If this story stirs something within you, if you feel drawn to the forgotten corners where history blurs into the unknown, join us. Subscribe to this channel and continue exploring the shadowed past that official records chose to forget. Leave a comment with your thoughts on this haunting case and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next journey into the darker folds of history. There are countless more